Hello and welcome to the FEMA National Webinar on the State Mitigation Planning Policy Update. My name is Kathleen Carlisle. I am a mitigation planner and policy advisor for the National Mitigation Planning Program in FEMA's Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration. Next slide, please. So what are we going to cover today? First, we're going to provide a very brief overview of the program. Many of you are likely familiar with mitigation planning, but some of you may be newer to planning. So we will introduce the program. Then we'll introduce the State Mitigation Planning Policy Guide, which is this update. And we will include a summary of the changes and then go into a little bit more detail on standard and enhanced state requirements and some of the procedural updates to this policy. Finally, I will go over next steps and provide a few resources. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to start out with sort of what I like to call the 20,000-foot view, but we will zoom in on the requirements in a few minutes. So we'll start with this overview. So first, just a few definitions. Hazard mitigation is any sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate the long-term risk to human life and property from hazards. And that is from our regulation at 44 CFR section 201.2. And hazard mitigation planning is the process used by state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to identify their risks and vulnerabilities associated with natural disasters, and to develop and implement strategies to reduce or eliminate long-term risk. Hazard mitigation plans are the blueprint for mitigation and resilience, and they guide mitigation investments using a wide range of resources. Next slide, please. So there are several benefits to hazard mitigation planning. Planning definitely saves lives and reduces risk from future disasters. It is really that planning process and that plan as a foundation, just as mentioned in the previous slide, that will set up the community to take action that will reduce this risk. It helps with informed decision-making to include the whole community. It prepares states and communities to adapt to climate change, which is very important these days. We know we've been seeing a lot more disasters and more extreme weather conditions. Planning helps direct mitigation resources to where they are most needed, and it increases capacity to support faster disaster recovery. So it's worth putting in that effort ahead of time. Next slide, please. So this is a slide just to show the coverage of mitigation plans nationwide. All 50 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 territories have state mitigation plans that are approved by FEMA. And there are also more than 24,700 local governments that have FEMA approved plans or plans that are approvable pending adoption. And 224 tribal governments have current tribal mitigation plans. So there's a lot of coverage out there. Many communities have plans and have experience with planning. We always hope to keep increasing that where we can. Next slide, please. So a very important benefit of mitigation planning is that it provides eligibility for certain non-emergency FEMA grants. So this is the list of those grants, and as new programs come online, this list grows. So just to call out a few of these, some of these are for public assistance. One key category for eligibility is public assistance categories C through G. So that is that permanent work, not the emergency work, but that permanent work following a disaster. A mitigation plan is a requirement at the state level. Also, fire management assistance grants. There is a requirement to have a mitigation plan at the state level. And several hazard mitigation grants, including the new Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, which is replaced our pre-disaster mitigation program. And of course, flood mitigation assistance. And now there is a program, the High Hazard Potential Dam program, which was launched a couple of years ago. There are requirements in this update that relate to eligibility for that program. Next slide, please. So now we're going to introduce the State Mitigation Planning Policy Guide. So one key change with this update is the title. This was previously known as the State Mitigation Plan Review Guide. And now this is the new title, which reflects that this is FEMA's policy on mitigation planning. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this State Mitigation Planning Policy Guide is FEMA's official policy on and interpretation of the CFR at 44 CFR Part 201. Section 201.3 outlines the responsibilities of FEMA and the state. Section 201.4 outlines standard state requirements for standard plans, and Section 201.5 for enhanced state requirements. And just a note that states that do achieve the enhanced status are eligible for additional HMGP funding. Next slide, please. So here are a few of our key objectives that we were thinking about as we were updating this policy. So first, we really want to underline the value of planning. This should not be a plan that sits on the shelf. As we mentioned before, it's really the blueprint, the foundation for state and local governments as they move to successfully implement mitigation efforts and make mitigation investments. We are aligning with FEMA's strategic priorities, including planning for climate change and for equitable outcomes. We want to make sure we are connecting mitigation planning to community planning and land use planning and building codes. What we like to say here at FEMA, it's really about where and how you build. We want to support integration of mitigation planning with FEMA programs and other recent updates to those programs. As I mentioned earlier, we now have a new pre-disaster mitigation program that we call BRIC. And also we received feedback from our stakeholders in the summer of 2020. And if you're interested, you can click on the link to see those reports. And also we want to make sure we streamline the plan review and approval process and really provide more clarity on our procedures. So you'll see that the procedures section in the guide is somewhat expanded. Next slide, please. So this is a timeline of our process. We started this in 2020, as I mentioned earlier, with stakeholder engagement. A lot of writing and development over the 2020 to 2021 period, and a lot of reviews. So a lot of folks here at FEMA in all components had an opportunity to review the document, and then we finalized the document in April, and it will become effective April 19th, 2023. There is a note here, the High Hazard Potential Dams Program notice of funding opportunity did go out recently, and the policy update here for high hazard potential dams program eligibility is effective with the release of this policy. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to zoom in a little more, and we're going to talk about the updates to the State Mitigation Planning Policy. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we have standard state section in this policy for all states. All states need to get at least the standard designation to be eligible for those programs I mentioned earlier. And so we'll talk about the standard requirements first. So planning for climate change and considering equity in the mitigation planning process, that is really a key piece of this update. You'll see this in the risk assessment and mentioned in the planning process and other parts of the standard requirements. Planning process, we really want to create more clarity about what types of representatives need to be included in the planning process, such as those climate change experts and those who work in programs for underserved communities. The capability assessment calls out some specific areas to describe, including the state's current building codes and floodplain management. And this update includes a section outlining the requirements for the high hazard potential dams program and adds a stronger connection to existing fire management assistant grants requirements. So that's not a new requirement, it's really just making a stronger connection within the plan review process. Next slide, please. So for enhanced, and again, enhanced states are eligible for 5% additional HMGP funding. So for enhanced, we've introduced some more advanced lead times and pre-submission coordination for new enhanced states. And these details are provided in this procedural section in the appendices. And also the HMA grants performance requirements have been moved up to be a first step in the process for new enhanced plans, because we just know this is an area that can be challenging, and it's really important to make sure that those requirements are met before moving on in the enhanced review process. The state must also demonstrate that local jurisdictions have approved mitigation plans and that plans are not expiring. And finally, really important, FEMA strongly encourages the adoption of hazard resistant building codes, and that is outlined in the enhanced section. So really a strong expectation that enhanced states have resilient building codes. Next slide, please. Okay, so state responsibilities. The state has a lot of responsibilities. First of all, coordinating all the state and local mitigation activities and providing training and technical assistance. Updating the state mitigation plan every 5 years and submitting it for approval. But also reviewing and submitting approvable state and of course local plans to FEMA, and that's a big responsibility. So really it's not just the state plan, but also reviewing those local plans and assisting local governments with their planning processes. Communicating with and supporting local tribal officials interested in applying for FEMA assistance through the state. So providing those resources, prioritizing those resources, and making sure everyone's aware of those opportunities. Next slide, please. FEMA's responsibilities are to oversee all pre and post disaster mitigation programs and activities, FEMA is responsible for getting together with the state annually to review the mitigation program, and also for enhanced states to validate that enhanced status annually. And a key part of that, as I mentioned earlier, is ensuring that grants management is still in good order, good working order. Also, FEMA reviews and approves the mitigation plan every 5 years and communicates plan status data and eligibility information to the state. Okay, so state and mitigation planning policy organization. So this is really the organization of the document. On the left side, the main policy section includes these 4 sections, an introduction, again, covering those roles and responsibilities that I just mentioned, and then the standard requirements in section 3 and the enhanced requirements in section 4. And then the difference really with this policy update is you'll see more appendices and some longer appendices with these procedures, both for the standard submittal and also for enhanced submittal, and then a number of tools, plan review tool, which is used to review the plan. So FEMA will use that tool to review the state plan, and some templates, definitions, etc. So a lot of content there. Okay, this is just a quick look at a couple of the items here related to the plan review tool. It's a little more expanded this time compared to the last state plan, the mitigation planning policy update last time. It breaks down the elements question into the element parts. So it's all listed here on the tool, and that helps the reviewer communicate more clearly about which aspect of an element requires revisions. And the plan assessment, unlike the last guide, prompts the reviewer to provide strengths and opportunities for improvement for each part of the guide. So we do, this is all somewhat flexible on the plan assessment, but we do encourage our plan reviewers, planners to offer those suggestions for improvement and strength and commenting on the strengths. And we really do think it's worthwhile, especially when going for the next plan update. Okay. So now we're going to talk about updates to the state mitigation planning policy standard state requirements. So we're getting into more detail now and zooming in. Maybe we're at the 5,000 foot level now on these specific requirements. So planning process. So the overall framework for the state planning process is very similar to 2015. What is different is that the process outlines a broader range of state and other partners to involve in the planning process. So this includes agencies or partners who can provide data and technical information regardless of their discipline. The agency or department that oversees building codes, we can't emphasize that enough. It's just so important for states to, wherever they are, to begin really looking at that and striving for improvement where improvements can be made. Climate change experts, talked about that earlier. Really, really important to include them so that that information can be brought to bear on the risk assessment and the strategies. And agencies or departments who support underserved communities. We talked about equitable outcomes. And so bringing these folks in early will really help develop the plan in those areas. And then also community lifelines. So infrastructure and lifelines, very important. We covered this a bit in the 2015 guide, but we've definitely added more definition regarding made it more comprehensive with respect to community lifelines. FEMA does have information on lifelines on their website. And the plan really needs to describe how the state coordinates with these 7 sectors and these lifeline partners. So again, infrastructure, very important, and really looking at all these various planning sectors. So the risk assessment is a really key part of the state plan. And that is especially true because local governments often rely on the state plan to be a source of information about hazards. So in 2015, the State Mitigation Plan Review Guide introduced requirements to consider climate change and future conditions, really referred to that as changing weather conditions. So this continues in the 2022 guide. The 2022 guide also specifies that probability must address how climate change and future conditions affect the type, location, range of anticipated intensities, frequency, and/or duration of the identified hazards. So, for example, you might see in your state that wildfires are occurring in different locations and possibly more frequently. Floods might be more severe. Maybe you're seeing more flooding outside of mapped flood zones. So really making these connections to these various pieces of probability. And also the 2022 guide defines state assets. So it provides a little more of a concrete definition around what we mean when we talk about state assets as being state-owned or operated critical facilities, buildings, infrastructure, and lifelines. So the vulnerability assessment is also key to the risk assessment. The structure is similar to the 2015 guidance. So when we're thinking about the vulnerability, the 2022 guide clearly delineates that the vulnerability assessment addresses 2 things. The vulnerability of state assets, and that's in section S5 of the requirements, and that includes state-owned or operated buildings, as we just mentioned earlier, and from the local risk assessment. So vulnerability is also examined for the whole state based on the local risk assessments. So vulnerability of jurisdictions, item S6, includes an overview and analysis of the jurisdictions most threatened by current and future hazards and the jurisdictions most vulnerable to damage and loss with respect to the impact on populations, including underserved communities, structures, including critical facilities, and infrastructure and lifelines. So it's really breaking it down into these categories. And changes in development is a really key piece of the risk assessment. And this kind of ties back to that S6 section. So providing a summary of recent development and potential or projected development in hazard-prone areas based on the state and local risk assessments. So looking at the changes in land use, including projected future growth or where redevelopment might be happening. Also changes in population demographics, and the updated area here is looking and including socially vulnerable and underserved communities. So are you seeing, is the population aging or is it changing in other ways? Changes in development that could impact jurisdictions most threatened by hazards, including potential impacts from climate change. So considering climate change in the context of new development, and how does that change vulnerability? And then of course, changes to the vulnerability of the state's assets. So again, it's this 2-pronged approach, one looking at what does the state own and looking at the state as a whole based on the local risk assessments. So the capability assessment in the updated guide, it's the core requirement is to look at the state's policies, programs, and capabilities, their funding, with respect to how all of these capabilities can help the state achieve their mitigation goals, its mitigation goals. But what we've spelled out more here is that we want to specifically include certain things in this capability assessment. State land use laws, enabling legislation and other plans, the adoption and enforcement of building codes, how the state administers the NFIP, how the state participates in flood hazard mapping, and then use of non-FEMA federal funding for mitigation. So where, what other capabilities and partnerships does the state have in using these non-FEMA funding resources? And for this, it's really mostly a summary description. So just asking the state to look specifically and describe these capabilities where they exist. And for local planning, coordination, and capability building, the state needs to describe support for the development of approvable local government mitigation plans. And remember, that was covered when we talked about state responsibilities. And that includes any barriers that local governments might have for developing and implementing local mitigation plans, and and what steps to remove are there to remove these barriers? What steps are possible? And when prioritizing funding, the state should consider the following: high risk and high vulnerability communities, including underserved communities and socially vulnerable populations; high risk properties, and that includes repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures under the NFIP; and areas under intense development pressures that may experience increasingly severe impacts from climate change. So these are areas that FEMA really believes the state should include as they're prioritizing funding. Next slide, please. So other changes. So the 2015 guide did include a section for the state to describe its repetitive loss strategy. That is for those repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties in order to be eligible for a 90% cost share under the FMA program. The Biggert Waters Act of 2012 changed that. So that section is no longer required for that specific eligibility. We still believe it's very important as part of the risk assessment to look at repetitive loss properties or high risk properties, as was just mentioned in a previous slide. But that section's removed, and in its place now are the requirements for the high hazard potential dams program. And we've also added, as I mentioned previously, a very small section just as a cross check for the fire management assistant grants eligibility. And there were a few sections that really weren't changed at all. The mitigation strategy is largely the same. The section on review, evaluation, and implementation, and adoption and assurances. So those sections will look familiar and look the same as they did in 2015. So just a plug for the mitigation program consultation. Touched upon this really briefly as part of FEMA responsibilities, meeting with the states to go over mitigation program. This is an annual meeting, looking more than just mitigation planning, also other mitigation programs. So it's great to be as inclusive and comprehensive as possible, both on the FEMA side and the state side. It's a great opportunity to talk about challenges, talk about opportunities, areas where, things could be improved, make agreements, et cetera. It's very flexible. And there is a section early on in the updated guidance that talks about this program consultation meeting, and a summary is provided for the state. So it's a great opportunity, and really encourage everyone to make the most of this meeting. Okay, so we're going to talk now about updates to the State Mitigation Planning Policy for enhanced states. So we touched upon this when we talked about the summary of changes. So for enhanced states, we now have what we're calling prerequisites, which really is, this has always been in the guide. The first thing is the state has to meet all the standard plan requirements. So that's pretty basic. But also we've moved up the HMA grants performance elements just to ensure that the state is ready to take on the responsibility of being enhanced, because it's an ongoing responsibility, and the grants management piece can be challenging. So it's definitely a great, we're asking that there be more upfront work here, and we're really looking at that first. So it's just a change of order, kind of a change of emphasis in that beginning piece, and then moving on to the other requirements. And there is a dedicated procedures appendix for enhanced plans now, as we mentioned earlier. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this 12 months, and we're going to talk about the timelines in a few minutes. But again, it's that coming in very early, a year in advance, if you're new enhanced state, you've never been enhanced before, to work with FEMA and make sure the grants management looks okay. So the grants management section itself really isn't drastically different from the last guide. Documents and reports must be complete when submitted by the end of each program's application period. So these are some of the various requirements, and so now we're really looking at this completion. Applications and amendments must be determined to be complete within 90 days of submittal on or after the first request for information response. So that on or after is an addition, just to make that a little more clear. So those definitely take a look at them. They're not drastically different. They're just more clear. And again, they're unique for the mitigation planning requirements, because they are a little bit more prescriptive. And also a new requirement, a new procedure, is that there will be a grants management panel. So some folks outside of the FEMA region will work with the FEMA region to actually get some more eyes and help review the grants management performance during the enhanced review process. Integrated planning. So this is moving on to the planning requirements. So not real big changes, but just more definition, a little more in the narrative about demonstrating integration, and what it means to demonstrate that the plan is integrated. And again, looking at at these lifelines and the sectors, similar to the standard requirement, but really, again, it's more of a demonstration of integration, as opposed to just including folks in meetings and in the planning process itself. Land use development includes agency or department that regulates building codes and there's land use authorities. So again, very important to integrate around land use and building codes and across FEMA mitigation programs. So we've added more programs to this list of potential areas of integration. That doesn't mean absolutely everything on the list has to be met, but it's, you know, we're looking for that comprehensiveness. So we have added programs, including the National Earthquake Hazards Program, High Hazard Potential Dams, the National Dam Safety Program, FEMA's Cooperating Technical Partners program. So take a look at that. Okay, so demonstrating a commitment to a comprehensive program. So this is an important element in enhanced mitigation planning. So commitment to mitigation can be demonstrated through a number of activities and a combination of activities. So the first one listed here is statewide laws and frameworks. So thinking about programs and plans and initiatives. So what are some of possibly statewide planning laws and planning frameworks? Cross-state partnerships. So where does the state have some partnerships focusing on mitigation activities and investment? Multi-year planning, model floodplain ordinances that go beyond the NFIP minimum. So again, looking for kind of that excellence level in programming for enhanced states. And then training and capability building is another kind of big category and really important, because that is, again, a key responsibility of all states, but for enhanced states, really looking for outstanding efforts in training that go beyond just the basic G318 local mitigation planning trainings. So possibly setting up certification programs and for floodplain managers or things like that, but very important category. And then finally, as mentioned earlier, it's very important that states support local jurisdictions in keeping their plans updated and current. And for enhanced states, that's just defined as showing that at least 75% of all of its local jurisdictions that have previously submitted a mitigation plan are either currently approved or updating their plans. And for this calculation, to determine if 75% of local jurisdictions have plans that are currently approved or updating their plans, FEMA excludes special districts and includes jurisdictions that are approvable pending adoption. Okay, so continuing on demonstrating commitment to a comprehensive program, the state is strongly encouraged to demonstrate its commitment to mitigation by adopting and enforcing building codes that enhance mitigation and resilience. And this is really, very high priority for FEMA. FEMA does have a new building code strategy, and they're really emphasizing this in their strategic plans. So we define a hazard resistant building code as the current or next most recently published edition of a hazard resistant building code that's not amended or changed to weaken hazard resistant provisions. Local governments in the state also do not weaken the hazard resistant provisions in their building codes, and they're encouraged to adopt higher standards in locally adopted codes. And finally, state facilities should be compliant with current hazard resistant building codes. They're very important. Building codes save lives, reduce losses, and the statewide mandatory building code requirement is part of the BRIC technical evaluation criteria. So in the guide, you'll see some links to some other building code information resources. And FEMA does have on the building science section of its website some great studies about the effectiveness of building codes. The effective use of mitigation programs. This is the kind of the final, one of the final big requirements for enhanced planning. Really looking at how is the state comprehensively utilizing existing programs, both FEMA programs and other non-FEMA or federal mitigation programs. So again, this isn't drastically changed, but just we've added again more of these programs, and really for an enhanced state looking for that comprehensive use where it's relevant and applicable of these funding opportunities. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the procedures. So moving beyond what the actual requirements are and looking more at the process and the procedures. So we're going to start talking here about the new enhanced plans. Mentioned that earlier, but this gives you a visual. So again, if a state's interested in becoming enhanced for the first time, it's very important to come to FEMA at least 12 months in advance. We realize that's not always possible or exact, but that's the guideline. And this guideline is based on having the plan, the enhanced plan approved on the expiration date. I think many states have that goal of having the plan approved, the enhanced plan approved on the same date that the standard plan would expire. It's not required. Enhanced status can be granted at different times. It does not have to correspond with the approval of a standard plan. So if the state's able to get their standard plan before expiration, they can certainly take a few more months or whatever timeline they're on to become enhanced. But this time frame here assumes that there is that interest. Because the process can take a long time. We say at least 12 months in advance, come to FEMA and ask to begin the process of reviewing those HMA grants, performance requirements. And then at least 180 days, again, this is the guideline. We know it's not always exact. Submit the plan for review. And the region will notify HQ of this enhanced submittal, and you'll see that there are both regional reviews. There's an HMA panel, and then beyond the regional review, there is a national planning review panel. So there are a lot of steps and panels, and this does take time, and at any step, even following the regional review, there could be required revisions. So if there's a lot of coordination with FEMA ahead of time, and the state's on a really good track, hopefully there won't be required revisions. But if there are, those take time. So that's really one of the reasons why we like to build in so much time for these reviews. So this next slide is really just calling out that first, it's a little easier to see when these are separated. That's a kind of a busy flow chart, that first chart that we were showing you. But again, you can see here the various steps and the timelines. And the following slide is, again, breaking it down for those panel, the formal plan submission, the regional review and the panel reviews, and all of the various steps. And for an updated enhanced plan, so some states are already enhanced, you're just updating your enhanced plan, not nearly as long tail and involved as the new enhanced plan. The idea here, the assumption here is that every year the state and FEMA will be meeting during what we call the enhanced state validation to ensure that grants management is on track, to ensure the planning work is on track. And so hopefully through these annual meetings, everyone will be aware of the situation and will be ready when it comes time to submit the plan, and aware of, hopefully if there are any issues that pop up in the interim, there's time to address those and everyone at least has awareness. So this one, we recommend at least 60 days submittal prior to expiration, but I of course would always say earlier the better. But ideally, if both state FEMA have full awareness and things are moving along as they should, this shouldn't be as long of a process, not requiring the panel reviews, etc. So, but again, always earlier the better if possible, in case required revisions need to be made. And just a little overview, as I mentioned, this annual enhanced state validation, looking at the capabilities, the planning work, the grants management. And again, there's a template, reports, agreements may come out of this. I guess what I would say here is it's just very important that both the state and FEMA carefully document all of these outcomes in the meetings and kind of where we are and the status. Documentation, very important. Okay, so we're getting toward the end. I know this is a long haul. So some next steps, key takeaways, just a few things to keep in mind. So every plan update is an opportunity for continuous improvement and to advance mitigation. So always look at any planning assessments from the last go around and take all of the information from mitigation program consultations and enhanced state validations and just look at those opportunities for improvement during the update. Mitigation planning requirements are not prescriptive. It's important to address multiple issues. Those are very well spelled out, but we don't necessarily prescribe exactly how everything must be done. There are various approaches to planning. Some things work really well in some states and some things work really well in other states. So the requirements are consistent, but the approaches we understand can vary. The state plan informs statewide risk reduction efforts. So it guides local and tribal planning in instances where that's applicable. And so it's not just a plan for the state, it's for the state's assets and the state-owned and operated facilities and infrastructure. It's for all the local governments in the state. So really it's an important reference for the entire state as a whole. And early and ongoing coordination and communication with FEMA will help position the state for success. So back to those timelines and the earlier coordination, the better. And of course, as often as possible, and everyone's really busy, but the more communication lines are open and the coordination is continuing, we think that positions everyone for success. So the policy goes into effect, there's a one-year transition period. So the policy goes into effect on April 19, 2023. What this means specifically is that mitigation plans must comply with the policy in effect when the plan is approved. So it's very important to coordinate with your FEMA regional, regional mitigation planners very, very early to determine, timelines for review and ensure that your plan is approved in accordance with whichever guidance is in effect. So that means a lot of planning before this crossover period of April 19th, 2023. So we're hoping that this at least provides some time to understand the requirements and work them into the updates, but certainly contact your FEMA region to talk about how that can be done. So we have a few resources here that we wanted to list. We have our State Mitigation Planning Key Topics bulletins. These are from 2016. These will be updated along with our Local Mitigation Planning Handbook. Again, updated to reflect the new policies. And as always, we offer training. So please reach out for training and technical assistance. And also we have a few YouTube videos that are really worth watching here. Thank you for your time and attention. Again, my name is Kathleen Carlisle and my contact information is here. We really encourage states to reach out to their regional counterparts or FEMA regional partners throughout this update process. Again, thank you.